I will now pass you over to our moderator, Christopher Garnett. Chris runs his own consultancy, ChuteCourt Asesores, which helps funds, media companies, banks, and lots of other different forms of organizations make links, develop business, and do deals around the world. He is also the principal permanent advisor for the UK to the executive president of the Central American Bank for Economic Integration. He worked full-time for Euromoney between 1988 and 2016 and still advises them in various capacities. Christopher has always had a special interest in the business world, the political scene and the financial markets of Latin America, and has spent a considerable amount of time in the region. Most importantly, he is married to a Peruvian, so his knowledge of all things Latin American is first class. Chris, I'll pass over to you.
Thank you very much, George. I wasn't quite expecting my my life story to be paraded. But thank you anyway. So, ladies and gentlemen out there, as George has said, we're here to talk about the difficulties of public relations, and particularly in the sense of communicating with governments during the present crisis in Latin America, but we hope with general applicability. And of course, some ideas about how to overcome those difficulties. We've got an expert panel of 4 people, 2 chief executive officers from Ketchum, the global PR firm based in New York, obviously not a firm that needs introducing to anybody in this audience, I'm sure, but we have Gustavo Averbuj, who is the chief executive of Ketchum in Argentina, and is also the head of the PRCA's Latin American branch, which is a relatively new entity. And his colleague, I guess, Edgar Mata, is the CEO of Ketchum Costa Rica. Between them, they've got nearly 60 years of experience in the firm, so they probably know what they're talking about. Gustavo is joining us from Buenos Aires. Edgar is joining us from San Jose, Costa Rica. And our third panelist, Lucas de Aragao, is joining us from Sao Paulo, although based in Brasilia. He's a partner and director of Arko Advice, which is the biggest independent public affairs agency in Brazil. And when I first knew the firm 25 years ago, very, very much a political consultancy, so deep expertise on dealing with governments there. And last, and slightly differently, somewhat perhaps on the other side of the equation in terms of this conversation, Sergio Suchodolski is the president of the Development Bank of Minas Gerais. So he's joining us from Belo Horizonte in Minas Gerais in Brazil. He has a lot of experience in development banks, both international, the BRICS Bank in China, and BNDES, which of course is the Brazilian domestic development bank. So welcome to all of you. As George has said, we want questions throughout. I've got my Zoom webinar chat open, so I'll see your questions as they come in, and we'll turn to them as and when appropriate. So first of all, just a question to sort of get us into the context. I mean, it's fair to say all of us who know Latin America quite well would acknowledge that populations and businesses and governments in the region are quite used to dealing with crises, and pretty often they come back from those crises quite well. So I'm going to ask the panelists if they think that the COVID-19 crisis is different, or if it will be different. Edgar, I'm going to turn to you first, because I notice in your bio it says you're particularly good at crisis management. So Edgar, is it different this time?
Thank you, Chris. I would like to begin with a couple of warnings. First, I come from a 5 million people country, with tourism as the most important activity. Just from my window, I can see a couple of volcanoes, and I am not an exception. Nature is too close here. Strong democracy. We're talking about government, or we're gonna talk about government, with almost no dictatorial stories, and with no army, which is something about we are very proud. We're very socialist, no communist, but with a strong and deep socialist background. Taking this in account, I would say from the Central American and Costa Rican perspective, that this crisis caught the LATAM region not in a very good shape. Economies declining, social unrest, and a lagging of technology development, to mention a few. The coronavirus pandemic has led to historic economic contraction, with Latin America hit particularly hard. Yes, crisis, the COVID-19 crisis is definitely different, mainly because it's an opportunity to raise not from a resilience capacity, but to have new, fresh ideas to foster, I would say, to foster collaboration. And this word should be important today: collaboration, to reduce the region's structural heterogeneity, political fragmentation, and geopolitical irrelevance, to go to superpowers. That is where we should go.
Okay, there was definitely a PR message included in that. I spotted it. Sergio, let me turn to you. I mean, just before we carry on, obviously Latin America, very well known to be the kind of center of COVID infections. 6 of the top 12 countries in terms of cases detected are in Latin America. Of course, Brazil is at the top of that list. There is, it's worth saying, a wide variety of interpretations possible of these figures, though. I mean, if you look at the number of infected people who died, that varies hugely. If you look at the percentage of populations who've caught the disease, percentage of populations who died, and so on, it's a massive variation, which to me tells me that most of the figures are probably not very reliable. I hope that's not too controversial a point. But Sergio, from your point of view, obviously Brazil is top of this league table with 4.5 million cases, 1 in 47 of the population. Is this crisis and how you manage it from a messaging point of view dramatically different from, say, the Lava Jato crisis or earlier economic crises? What's your view?
Good morning, good afternoon, Chris, and thanks for having us to participate in this debate. Good morning to Gustavo, Edgar, Lucas, and George, and to everyone that is watching us both in Europe and elsewhere. No doubt that this crisis has a different nature, right? It starts as a health crisis in China. Sort of the whole world is watching it unfold in late December, early January. Then it hits Europe very hard in the case of Italy and Spain, and sort of spreads all over the continent and all over the world. And all of a sudden it hits South America around March, and it really established itself as a global crisis, starting with the health. So we have what we call in economics external shock from the health crisis that touches the social tissue and all the economic activities from a source that it's completely external to what were the dynamics in terms of economics until that point. I think at the same time, what we see in Latin America, in Brazil, but not only in Brazil, is that development banks, and this is our field of work, have been acting quite strongly as counter-cyclical agents to prepare a solid response, and especially to support small and medium enterprises, not only them, but a lot of emergency program. It is our case, it is the case of most of the development banks and institutions in Brazil and throughout Latin America to support the maintenance and of SMEs and the employment. That said, I think there is also an underlying interesting opportunity, if you may call so. I mean, it's a very difficult word to use in the middle of crisis, but which is to prepare a comeback in a much more sustainable way than before. And many discussions and instruments are being put in place for that purpose. As a matter of fact, we just had the election of the Inter-American Development Bank presidency last week, and I think this will be a key feature in terms of what the post-COVID development finance will look like in Latin America. Thank you.
Okay, let's not delve too much into the IDB at the moment, but we might well come back to it because it's a fascinating development which people may not know about. So we'll talk about that a little later. Gustavo, I'm going to turn to you. I mean, I don't want to bang on too much about these numbers and so on, but the contrasts are really stark. I mean, one in every 1,000 Peruvians has died, whereas if you look to Uruguay, there've only been 45 deaths in the whole country. Smaller population, of course, but that's 1 in 77,000 people. So, you know, the differences across the region are stark. Obviously, there are societal and economic differences between Uruguay and Peru, but they're not on different planets. You're sitting across the River Plate from Uruguay.
Yes.
Give us your general answer to the question, but also I'd just be interested to know, what are people saying there about Uruguay and why have they been so lightly affected by this?
I would start by saying that the Argentinian president, who was just in the office when all this broke up, in his very first speech said something like, there is a choice between health and economy, and I'm going to take the health route. I don't care about the economy. My aim is to save lives. And though it was a very political speech, I would say that choice has been kind of in the works in most countries all over the world and in Latin America. So Mr. Bolsonaro, just to mention our friends here in Brazil, said, I am taking the choice of the economy. Kind of, I need the economy to keep running. And some other countries said, I'm going to do whatever it takes to care for the healthcare. Uruguay was one of those, and it's even worse because not most of the death, but most of the very early infected people were because they were at an illegal party. So kind of everyone of the first batch was at that party. Someone had just came from abroad and infected everyone else. I would say also that coronavirus has just made more acute whatever was in the work previously. Like whatever country had a strong healthcare structure, ministry, whatever, and it was good in health terms, is responding better than the ones who do not. So Uruguay in this case had a pretty nice healthcare structure, ministry, etc., and so they are doing better. The other thing is how obedient, that's not the word I like very much, is the population. So whenever the authorities say, stay home, Argentinians immediately say, okay, let's go out. We are not kind of the people who would obey this kind of healthcare orders. We did for the first couple of months, but now we are supposedly quarantined, and it all depends on your own attitude. So I would say, and also in some cases, the way the people live makes it very difficult to contain the infection. Like if there is 10 people living in a 2-story little slum house, most probably they will get infected in the end. So
yeah, I know there are literally hundreds of interesting points we could talk about in this. But your point about foreigners, people coming from abroad to parties, there was an interesting dichotomy where Ecuador, for example, the infection, which was very badly hit at the start, the infections began. Lots of rich international people caught it. The same happened in Peru. So people in the slum areas and in the poor areas were the last people to catch it because it came from people with international connections. a wedding party in Guayaquil, started the whole thing in Ecuador. Anyway, we must move on from that, because no doubt there are many fascinating aspects of it that we could be talking about. But Lucas, I'm going to turn to you with a slightly different aspect of the question, which Gustavo and Edgar have already touched on. I mean, the crisis in health is one thing, and I think it's a very amorphous thing. We can't really see the impact of that. But what we can absolutely and incontrovertibly see, aside from all the medical mitigations, vaccines and quarantines and so forth, what we can really see very clearly is the economic impact. And it's not the economic impact of the disease, of course, it's the economic impact of the attempts to control the disease, as Gustavo has just said in President Fernandez's sort of decision on that. So, Lucas, we're really talking about managing communications in an economic crisis. Let's just leave the medical thing entirely to one side. That's what we should really be worried about, isn't it?
Good morning to all. Good afternoon for those watching us abroad. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for the invitation. Chris, Brazil started President Bolsonaro, when coronavirus hit the country. He started a narrative of talking a lot about the economy, of the importance of the economy and how unemployment would lead ultimately and possibly to more pain and more deaths than the coronavirus itself. I think one point that it's important to mention is, although this was the narrative, it wasn't a decision that he made in Brazil, because as a lot of you know, Brazil is a federation where the states have the sovereignty to make their own decisions. So early on in the coronavirus pandemic, the Brazilian Supreme Court made a decision saying that the opening of the economy, bars, restaurants, malls, even schools, were decisions to be made by the states. So Sergio is in Minas Gerais. The decision to open the schools there is not from Bolsonaro, but from the governor of Minas Gerais, Romeu Zema, as in São Paulo is from João Doria. Bolsonaro obviously had upper hand on the issue because as the president, he pressured towards this narrative. He set by example, but decision-making was always under the umbrella of the regional governments. The economic situation in Brazil, and this is important to mention, was already very grim before the coronavirus. We already had 12, 13 million unemployed in Brazil. And you have to count those that aren't in the statistic of being unemployed because they're not even searching for jobs. And they are just in the country without working, without studying, but they're not employed. They're not contributing to the productivity of the country. Brazil has been a country that the election has always been decided by the economy. We're a very pragmatic population. If we look back, Brazil in 30 years elected a young politician from the Northeast, then elected a PhD from Sorbonne. Then we moved on to a union leader with no formal education. We elected a woman president, something that a lot of mature democracies around the world have not done, such as the United States. And then we elected a captain from the army from the right. So the economy is what dictates this country. It's very hard for a president to be elected, re-elected with high unemployment, with low GDP, with the temperature in the streets being bad for the people to get a job. It's amazing that Bolsonaro now is tapping into the electorate that just 2 years ago treated Lula as a hero. And they are completely antagonic in their views of how to manage Brazil, in their narratives. They have similarities in their personalities, on their charisma, but politically they are on opposites. Why? Because the economy in Brazil has always dictated everything. Politics in Brazil has always been dictated, especially post a dictatorship in Brazil, has been the rule of law, and the country has been the economy. That is why President Bolsonaro made this narrative towards the economy. And that is why now President Bolsonaro is able to, and there are many reasons to criticize President Bolsonaro. And here I'm not giving my opinion. It's not a merit. I often tell people that when I'm talking that it doesn't matter what I think about Bolsonaro. It matters how I read the scenario and the perception that I can bring from what is seen in the country. And the reality here is that he has been able to fluctuate during the pandemic with popular support. Why?
It's fair to say, sorry to interrupt you, Lucas, but it's fair to say as well that the economic crisis is likely to be less severe in Brazil than it is in some other countries.
For a toll, yes. We are recovering quicker. There are studies from several institutions, banks, that Brazil is recovering quicker, partly because there was a point here, and I used to say this in the beginning of the pandemic. I said, look, the decision-making process will be made by politicians, not by doctors. If we were under a medical dictatorial system, we would be in quarantine for 2 years. But we will have the decision-making process in the democracies being made by politicians who are people suffering pressures. And there will be a point that people will no longer stay at home. They will no longer stay at home.
It is worth pointing out, of course, that in this region as a whole, variations from country to country, of course, but a vast number of people work in the informal economy. And the simple fact is that if you don't go out and deliver a moped tire or sell some oranges today, you don't eat tomorrow. So the whole process of lockdown is a dramatically different thing from what we know in Europe or the United States. Gustavo, let me turn back to you. Argentina, it's fair to say, no stranger to economic crises. How is the government going to, will it continue to wash this idea that yes, we were in a bad state before, and yes, it's going to get even worse, but that's all because of COVID? How will they convince people that it's not because of their economic incompetence?
I don't know why you assume they will convince people.
How will they try to convince people?
Okay.
If you were working for CFK,
for the government, what would I say?
First of all, it's not CFK anymore, but it might be.
Okay.
What would you say?
I'm going to build up one little thing on what Lucas said, which I think it's really interesting, and that is, the current government in Argentina tried to make it look like they were aligning with that the decisions were made by the infectologists. There is a huge infectology advisor group here in Argentina. And the decisions were made by politicians, yes. Unfortunately, I would say, in Argentina and in many of our countries, there is no real economy people being included into the decision making from companies, for enterprises, for whatever. So as this is impacting us just now, I would say the economy is going to suffer because the decisions are made from a political point of view, not from an economical point of view, not at all. So the economy is pushing somehow. It's saying, okay, we can't stay any longer with the business closed. We need to find a solution. And right now, most of our economies are not finding an answer to that question. So that kind of makes it hard, if you wish.
One doesn't always put Argentina and the Northern Triangle of Central America into the same sentence. But there is something in common in that, of course, a huge part of Argentine economic activity, and the same would go for Honduras, Guatemala, El Salvador, and so on, is agriculture. People continue to buy agricultural products. You suffer, of course, in the tourism, which is an important element for Argentina. But I want to turn to Edgar with this very specific point. Central America divides into two. There's your bit, which is where tourism is the main economic activity. And then there are the countries further to the north where agriculture is the main economic activity. And people are going to continue to drink coffee and continue to eat bananas, however bad the economy gets. Well, I'll stay with you, Gustavo. Just a point on the agriculture. Do you agree with my point on that? That's a bit of a cushion for Argentina? And then I'll turn to Edgar and ask him his view on that from a Central American perspective.
Yeah. I agree. I mean, don't forget about non-traditional products. Central America has doing a good effort in terms of the production and exportation of non-traditional products. That means plants and other kind. I mean, ornamental plants and other kind of products, non-traditional. But I would like to say that well, we are talking about 50 million people in Central America right now. This is the amount of general terms of the people that we are talking about. But in these two Central Americas that you are talking, we're facing a really strong point in terms of a word that I have to take to the table today, which is corruption. I have unfortunately I have to mention and to talk about that word strongly.
Don't worry, it's on the agenda later on. So bring it up.
But in terms of this crisis specifically, there is a phrase that have turned very popular in Central America, especially in Honduras right now, which is, where is the money? And this crisis took again and strongly this question about the way how the government invests the money, specifically to work against the coronavirus. In Guatemala, they are right now establishing a new ministry is the Ministry of Center of the Government in Guatemala. In Nicaragua, a lot of the political officials has been not required, but questioned by the government of the USA, and the Nicaragua government and the country in general terms is a little bit isolated. So this is a problem that we are really facing in Central America, related with the credibility, which is the other crisis that we are facing. Actually, we are facing two crises: the coronavirus, and I would say the credibility situation that we are facing in terms of, and not only with the government. We have to be careful about this. The entrepreneurial sector has a problem of credibility too. So
yeah, well, that's certainly true. But it's all these things are so multi-layered, aren't they, Edgar? I mean, if you look, we don't have anybody from Peru, so I'll be the person from Peru. I mean, Peru has been one of the most successful stories economically in Latin America in the last generation. It's a net creditor nation. Almost as soon as COVID hit, it allocated 13% of its GDP to COVID mitigation strategies. It went straight away and borrowed a huge amount of money in the international bond markets, which was massively overbid. It had one of the hardest lockdowns in the world. And where is it now? Oh, and by the way, the president is the most popular president there's been for as long as anybody can remember in terms of the population, if not the Congress. But where is Peru now? The hardest hit country in the world in terms of cases per capita. So, you know, it's not just a simple where's the money thing. I mean, the money was there, but the containment didn't work.
May I chime in with a comment? Kind of prior to COVID, half of the population of Latin America was poor people under poverty lines. And with COVID, that has somehow increased even 5 or 10% more. So I would say that generally speaking, and back to what you were mentioning, the economy will find its own solution somehow, meaning that if the political structure will not give them answers, and I would ask Sergio for this, or if the money that Latin America somehow expects the world to help them because there is not enough money for whatever reason. I'm not going to get into the cultural questions here. But we are crisis survivors. Generally speaking, it's a mixture between living on your own and doing however you can, and or borrowing money, and then after a couple of years going into default. I'm not mentioning Argentina here specifically; it's everywhere. So, so
that's
I would
a little
say
unfair.
it is. I know. So the thing is, I do think that the system will somehow find ways if the political structure do not give them answers. So, answering some of the questions on the chat, I would say we are crisis survivors. We are used to crisis. And this applies to most of us. Edgar, fortunately for him, lives in Costa Rica, which is a very nice country. But otherwise, Brazil, what's new? I mean, Lucas was saying all these presidents at the same time. I could mention for Argentina and for Brazil, a crisis in every of these presidencies that ended up either with someone being injunctioned or whatever. It's an economical crisis and whatever, and we survived. And here we are.
You have just had the first ever non-radical president finish his term of office, though, for 120 years. So that's some achievement. Sergio, I'm going to turn to you. I'm slightly conscious of the fact we're halfway through, and although we're having a very interesting conversation, we aren't really talking about how people communicate. I mean, from the point of view of the state of Minas Gerais, Sergio, how have you or how's the state government interacted with companies, for example, with businesses in the state to try and get everybody pushing in the same direction, to try and get your policies enacted at a business level? How have you done that?
Thank you, Chris. In our view here at the state, and the state is run by a governor that is not coming from a political trajectory. He is a very successful businessman. He had a liquidity event just before the elections. It was the first time he was running for office. He was not considered to be on the winning ticket, so he was a bit of a surprise. And he's also a member of a party that was established only 5 years ago. Actually, this week, the new party, Partido Novo, celebrated 5 years of existence. So it's a new political force. Really, and I would say a little bit of a phenomenon in terms of winning the second largest state in population in Brazil. That said, the vision here at the state level is that there is no antagonism between the health side and the medical side. Actually, in terms of communication, our governor every day, there is I think at 4 p.m. every day Brazil time, there is a he speaks to the press. So there's a press conference, and most days the health secretary and the economic development secretary sit by his side and provide sort of their actions, the numbers in terms of the death toll, but also in terms of investments. I'm talking about investments in hospitals, respirators, other kinds of measures. And on the business side, we also provide kind of a screening of each of the zones in Minas Gerais. We're talking, Minas Gerais is a very large state in terms of size, is larger than Germany. We have 21 million inhabitants, and it's a state that it's in the heart of Brazil. That means that we are neighboring Rio, São Paulo, Bahia, and also the federal district. So the capital of Brazil, we are side by side in terms of our borders. So we have been managing the crisis in terms of communication and also translating in terms of numbers in pretty interesting and successful ways. We've been one of the least affected so far in terms of the death toll and also in terms of the disease spreading through the state. And following Lucas' comment on the decision by the Supreme Court, what we did here is that the state level, the governor provides the screening and all the guidance in terms of which region could open up, what kind of businesses we recommend. But ultimately, because of the federal system we have, the decision is made by each mayor. So there is a recommendation based on numbers, on data. So it's a data-driven recommendation. And each mayor individually will choose to adopt or not the recommendations that have been granted by the state government.
Okay. And are you talking, as well as talking to populations, which you've just described the means by which you do that, are you talking specifically to businesses? Do you have a kind of business council that convenes, that agrees and discusses COVID policy?
Yes, we have a sort of a emergency business group where the representatives of different sectors, different business sectors, industry, agriculture, just general commerce, small business association, regional associations, they all meet in this council. I'm also a member of this council, which became sort of a small war room exercise. So there is a lot of information flowing in and out of this council, and which is helping to drive the decision-making on the state level as well.
Lucas, let's go back to Edgar's point about corruption. I mean, obviously corruption has been a huge story in Latin America over the last few years. Many presidents have fallen as a result of it. But is this affecting the way companies are able to communicate? I mean, how do companies, obviously part of the corruption often it comes between governments, is because governments and companies are too close to each other. But as companies have proved to be corrupt, how do they reset their relationship with government? How do they get the message of corporate integrity reinforced or recovered?
Chris, the companies involved in the famous car wash operation here in Brazil, they are having a very difficult time rebranding themselves in their fight to be part of the conversation again. Obviously, Petrobras, who was one of the main actors in the scheme, it's a different case because being a state-run company with certain monopolies in the country, it's part of our ethos to have Petrobras as a giant. However, you have other players, big companies, the construction companies involved, that are having a very hard time in the country, mainly because the debate between the judicial branch, the public prosecutors, and the companies have made it very hard for them to press the reset button. There are deals being made between the companies and the public prosecutors that have to be authorized by the judiciary system. Often they do not go ahead because because the companies and the public prosecutors don't reach an agreement. There were foreign companies involved here in Brazil in corrupt acts in the past, both in the car wash operation, as in other situations as well with state governments. But ultimately, I have a sense that the corruption in Brazil changed its level, not because of awakening of the Brazilian political system, a Buddhist awakening that we have to be good people and we have to move into the right direction. But truth be told, the car wash operation put a lot of big fish in jail here in Brazil. So can you imagine that 2 former presidents were in jail? You had CEOs of Fortune 500 companies. You have had owners of banks. And I think that overall, the car wash operation has a very positive impact in the mentality of doing business here in Brazil. I'll give my example.
And do you think it's changed? Sorry, but please do in a second. But do you think it's changed the companies that were specifically involved? Obviously, their relationships with government are bad and difficult. But do you think it's changed generally for all businesses how they interact with government? Because all businesses are, you know, you're all corrupt. Those guys are corrupt. I bet you're corrupt as well. Is that a fundamental problem?
I think it changed completely, Chris, in several examples. I'll give one example from my company. Arko structures public affairs and government relations strategies for other companies. I lost pre-car wash many clients to one-man shows in Brasilia, guys that did not have a company, but they had the solution. And sometimes the solution was very quick, very efficient, but the price would come much further on in federal police visits at 6 a.m. My solution was lengthy and boring and very institutional, and some companies wanted a fast solution. So they went to these one-man shows. These guys are not in the picture anymore. They are now not options for these companies to hire in Brasilia. So I think the companies first, they started to professionalize their public affairs and their government relations in Brazil. Pre-car wash, they thought that it would be very easy to find an easy solution through these spin doctors in Brasilia. And now the solutions have become much more institutionalized. For instance, at Arko, we work with around 40, 50 multinationals who are big companies listed in multiple markets around the world. The level of compliance that now I have to go through to be hired by them is at a whole new level. And I see them much more willing to be engaged in Brasilia on the day-to-day rather than just outsourcing the solution to someone in Brasilia to take care of their business.
There's a question from somebody in the audience, and I don't know if anybody wants to answer it. I'll give you all the choice. Somebody would like to hear about Venezuela. Does anybody have a view on Venezuela? If somebody's going to take on the PR account for the Venezuelan government, I would buy them a big cigar, I think.
I'm going to give, very, very short, I'm going to give the kind of our kind of official wording on this, and then I will let Edgar comment, and that is, we used to have an operation in Venezuela for more than 20 years. In the last, I would say 5, 6, 8 years, it has been reducing in size because mainly they had very little to do, both media being controlled by the government, and they were mainly helping companies that were going out of Venezuela, however they can, because it's not allowed. And unfortunately, 2 months ago, the decision was taken to close that operation. So we no longer work in Venezuela officially. So I think that gives you a point of view, if you wish.
I'm sorry, I'm not going to be really polite here, but I have to say that I think, and I want to say, and to take this opportunity to talk about. There are trends definitely in these moments, and one of this is the populism. The populism right now is increasing. I mean, to the right and to the left, to both sizes. And talking about Venezuela, I have to say that word again. For sure, I think there is a lack of political education or understanding about the political issues in terms of the population, from the population. And the other trend for sure is the increase of poverty and the socioeconomic gap. So I have to say that when I think about Venezuela, I personally think about all of these of these trends. I would like to take the advantage of the moment, Chris, to say something very fast that I don't want to forget to say from the company's perspective too, which is, well, I don't want to look the naive of the panel, but I would like to say that this is a good moment for empathy from the company's side. There is a good moment to get involved in causes, environmental, health, education. It is a good moment to strengthen the social commitment of the companies with the people, with the community, with the government, with the vendors. And just 30 seconds to talk about one tool specifically, which is a tool coming from Oxford specifically, which is the multidimensional poverty index. I would invite the people in the panel with us to go to the multidimensional poverty index, which is a tool that really helps the companies to know, to measure, and to change the company and to change the poverty in the company, inside the company. And this is one from our experience in Costa Rica. And I'm not working for Oxford. We just use the tool, and I think it's really usable in terms of how to reduce this gap that we are talking about from the company and doing something specifically. Sorry, Chris.
No, that's quite all right. I want to, we've only got about 10 minutes or so left. We've got a couple of questions, one addressing the how do you get cut through with populist governments, but none of, well, I would hesitate to characterize any of the governments whose citizens are represented here as populist, but perhaps that's inaccurate. But let's talk just more in general. Are there specific PR lessons from Latin America, used as it is to dealing with crisis, as we've talked about, that other people can learn from in other parts of the world, perhaps in other emerging markets, or perhaps indeed in Europe or in the US?
Chris, I wanted to start because I think that's a perfect question for the moment. I think that the biggest lesson in terms of understanding a political dynamic, and Sergio being inside an institution right now knows that, is that the first step to knowing how to do PR and governmental relations and advocacy in Brazil is to get on a plane and come to Brazil. There is no way to engage with Brazilian government through your computer. And the first lesson of this is that Brazil is a very personalistic country. So I often receive clients at my company and they say, oh, we started engaging with the Ministry of Economy or the Ministry of Citizenship. But we went to the right people, but people don't know what we're talking about. And I said, how did you know it's the right people? Oh, I printed the organogram from their website and I wanted to speak. And I said, first rule of Brazilian political affairs, shred the organogram, because the way to do politics in Brazil is to knowing who is the decision maker. And the decision maker is not always obvious. There were moments in Brazilian governmental history, for instance, I will give you a practical example. When Brazil was buying the fighter jets, either from Sweden, the Gripen, the French from Rafale, and the F-18s from Boeing. If you looked solely on the organogram, you would go to the wrong people. The main decision player for a period of time was the Secretary of Treasury of Brazil, because he was good friends with the president. It was a sovereign decision, and he was a fan of aviation. So because of the coincidence of the facts, he became a decision maker. So I think the biggest lesson that I've learned from all my years here is that you have to have boots on the ground. You can't be a war journalist far from the war. I never trust when I turn on the Brazilian television and there's a guy from New York talking about Syria. I always say, wait, you don't know what's going on in Syria. You're talking from Manhattan. So it's the same thing with Brazilian public affairs. You have to have boots on the ground And the first rule is to map. Brazil is a country that is very different and very difficult to understand. So I think the first lesson is mapping the stakeholders and understanding who is who in the decision-making process. And I think a lot of foreign companies doing public affairs in Brazil are lazy in doing this process, and they often go to the easy task of just going to the obvious people. And in Brazil, the decision-making process is not obvious. The decision-making process is not a straight line that has a methodology. It's a crazy line, like a roller coaster, often with no methodology, and you have to accompany it closely to find where it's going to lead.
Gustavo, you're nodding enthusiastically.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. I absolutely agree with Lucas. I would add, you need to understand the culture, the way people think and behaves. It's kind of each country around the world works differently, and you need to understand how people feel, live, and think in these countries. And that applies to all over Latin America, and I think over the world as well, but at least in Latin America. The other thing is that I would say as kind of lessons learned, family and solidarity and the surroundings around you are very strong. We kind of, all of us come from Italy, Spain, Latin roots that meant that there is a body language to be understood, that you hug the people, that you kiss the people. It's your family around. And in times of crisis, you help. So even if you have very, very little money, you help. So I would say kind of bring that into account at the moment that you're thinking, I'm going to answer to Eleanor. I wish I had some answers to Eleanor's questions, I wish. But one of the things would be, think as a Latin American, think as a Brazilian, think as an Argentinian. There is not the other thing is, there is no Latin America. Yeah, I'm the regional director for Latin America. There is no Latin America. There is no one size fits all thing. Like poor Edgar, he gets every day a question about, okay, all in Central America. And he has to say, you know, it's 7 countries. It's not the same thing, a Panamanian than a Costa Rican. And the same happens to me. People think that I may kind of, that there is one size fits all media thing, like, okay, CNN in Espanol is going to give you the coverage for everyone. Well, you know, it doesn't work that way. Not to mention PR Newswire or crazy things that some people
That's true,
come
Gustavo.
and say.
That's why when people ask me an opinion about Argentina, even if I have one, I don't give it, because I think it's not my place.
Well,
I would like to take the advantage of the moment to add something to the Lucas statement, which is this definition of the map of stakeholders have to be related with the connection. I mean, it is important to connect, really connect, and specifically with the government, with the stakeholder, which we are talking about right now. But how to connect and how to establish this connection with this stakeholder specifically.
I would make one general point, which, I mean, generalizations are always invidious, but having dealt at one time or another with every government between the Rio Grande and Tierra del Fuego, with single exception of Belize, in my case, I would make one general point, and I'd be interested in your comments on it. Because public servants, civil servants, communications people, research people, strategy people within government ministries are generally rather poorly paid. They are somewhat insecure. These organizations are very hierarchical, so they're afraid always of what the next person in line is going to say. In Latin America, the same would apply in many other places too, of course, but in Latin America, it is always absolutely necessary to go to the top. And you know that everybody who goes into the region says, I'm friends with the minister, I'm friends with the president. And that is the way people still get things done. I'm not commending it, because obviously in countries with more, shall we say, professionalized bureaucracies where people are better paid and so forth, you have much more responsible people taking on the roles and actually doing the roles which officials' titles suggest they would do. But of course, they're unable to do it because in the end, you know, General so-and-so or Minister so-and-so will just call up his friend and the contrary policy will be decided. Now, I'm caricaturing this, but I do speak from many years of personal experience. How do you all recognize that characterization of the way bureaucracies work in your countries?
I would defer, Sergio, 1 second, and I would defer to what you're saying. Like, yes, you have to go to the top, but our public servants in general know the way to stop whatever you want to implement if they so wish. So you may say, I'm going to make a reform on schools, and the ministry buys it, and the economy ministry says, I will give you the money. But when you start going down the structure, you end up being stuck somewhere from someone who doesn't want to. And they if you wish, the bureaucracy, the administrative side of government is here forever. There is a saying in Argentina, but it applies to many of our countries, that says, ministers come and go, we stay. So yes, you need the top guy to buy it, but you also need someone to help you kind of work out the ways of the state bureaucracies around to find out, okay, who, as Lucas was saying, who's the decision maker, who's the one who will make it happen. And many times this is not the minister. But I will let you, sir, let Sergio answer as well.
Yes, I tend to agree with Gustavo, but also shedding some light in terms of the situation in Minas Gerais and in Brazil in general. We do have, and this was built, I would say, more strongly over the past 25, 30 years, but especially the last 15 years, a very well-trained and well-paid bureaucracy, especially specific careers. Central Bank of Brazil, National Treasury, former Minister of Planning and Development, they have their own careers. Foreign Service of Brazil, the military. In the state level, in our case, we are one of the few, but we have a school of government here in Minas Gerais. And this is undergrad training. And once they graduate, they become permanent civil servants under the planning secretary, but being able to be seconded all over the government. I actually have quite a few of these permanent civil servants, and they are well trained. Many of them have obtained degrees from prestigious universities all around the world. Actually, my chief economist is a secondee from the Treasury, National Treasury, and he's a Harvard-trained economist. I actually have two of them.
You're absolutely right, Sergio, and I revised my earlier remark because Brazil is certainly, to a large part, an exception to that. And Brazil, it seems to me, in terms of careers in the public service, mirrors rather the kind of French model.
French model, yes.
Getting a professional administrative career in a government ministry is the pinnacle of ambition.
Yes, we actually have a national school of administration, just like École Nationale d'Administration in France, and so it's no coincidence. I mean, it was very much inspired by the French tradition, and this creates, I think, some very positive features, which is kind of a checks and balances and a more professional kind of modern data-driven decision making. I mean, to an extent, of course, not all ministries can count on this qualified staff, but they're also very strong as a corporation, right? I mean, they are very strong as kind of their own body and their own interests. And this also creates problems in terms of some of the reforms, especially administrative reform. They have a very strong say. Just to complement this and kind of diving into the last question, but very quickly, I believe we have a very strong democracy here, and we can see tests, stress tests even, time and again between the different branches. I'm talking about the Supreme Court, the Congress, and the federal government. And I would even say that surprising alliances have been formed. Just last week, we had the announcement of the major commercial banks joining forces with the agribusiness and some of the most prestigious NGOs in the environmental sector to design a common agenda regarding the environment in Brazil, because this has become a serious global PR problem that is affecting businesses, especially international trade in these sectors. So perhaps Lucas can provide more light, but I think this provides a pretty good example of how strong and live democracy we have here, despite any kind of specific challenges that we may be facing.
I consider myself admonished. And as, of course, in virtually every aspect of discussion of Latin America, Brazil is a dramatic exception, but every country is an exception in its own way, clearly. But Brazil is different in virtually every respect from the rest. What Sergio just pointed out is a valid part of that. Please, Lucas.
I'd like to make a comment on your last point about the knowing the minister. It's a very common thing here in Brazil. I know the minister. He told me that, and it's very common. I used to say that public affairs and advocacy and lobbying, just like anything in life, there are two ways to do it: the right way and the wrong way. So you have to choose your path. The right way here in Brazil, not just knowing the minister is not enough. It's never enough. Like FDR once said, "You've convinced me, now apply pressure on me." What you need here in Brazil is a structure to create a narrative, to create a coalition, to create a perception towards the advancing of a public policy. Here, I said that many times to my contacts at the Ministry of Economy today. The Ministry of Economy, as you know, here in Brazil is liberal, market-friendly, fiscally responsible, have a lot of good ideas. And I told them on day one, a good idea here in Brazil will die very quickly, because the merit is not where the game ends in Brazil, it's where it starts. So once you have a good policy, you have to create an entire narrative to put that in place. And that for public affairs is the same thing. Power here in Brazil is very diffuse, it's everywhere. So even for decisions that don't necessarily involve a stakeholder that you're looking at the time, you have to look at sometimes players that are around, fluctuating around the decision-making process. I've seen many times decisions that were supposed to be made exclusively by the executive, but they became such a big issue that the Congress, even not having legal formal say on that policy, they engaged and they had an effect on how that decision was being made. So here in Brazil, I think the idea of knowing someone is very important, but much more from an intelligence standpoint, from knowing what they think, and that being a variable in your PR and your PA strategy. But I feel that PA and PR campaigns in Brazil are long and very tough if you want to do the right way.
And if we want to do it the right way, we should call Arko.
There are other options, but I think we're the best.
Looks like. I would like to add to this comment from Lucas to talk about the role of the media too. And I would like, we are talking about Latin America and Central America from my side specifically. I would like to talk about the role of the media in this moment, because traditional media had turned important again, at least in Central America. People is informing from the traditional media. The official information people is getting from the traditional media, not to the new media. So I think it is important to take this element, this aspect in account. I have a friend who in the panel, in the audience, who already wrote to me and saying, Edgar, you mentioned corruption, populism, lack of credibility. Come on, talk about solutions. I don't wanna lose the opportunity to say education. And we as companies and our clients as companies has a role on this. It's not only a role of the government. We have the possibility to make a big impact in Latin America, and I have to talk about Central America specifically, education to reduce this lack of everything, poverty, education, unliteracy in terms of political education, etc.
Well, certainly the education deficit in Latin America is as dramatic as it is anywhere else, of course, with massive variations across the whole region. We have overrun our time by some 10 minutes. I'd just like to ask each of you for a sort of final word. If you look down the original agenda that we discussed, not much of which we've talked about, as predicted, that's always the way. The agenda is something to deviate from, not to follow. But I'd like each of you to give an example to our audience of somebody who's winning and somebody who's losing the PR battle in Latin America at the moment. We've heard quite a bit about Brazil. Just before the two Brazilians get going again, I just want to say, from my point of view, that the international public image of Brazil is a parody of what Brazil really is. Brazil is probably, and Brazilian politics in particular, one of the least well understood fields of human endeavor that anybody ever looks at. So whatever you think of, or whatever you think of Bolsonaro, you're probably wrong, and you could be wrong from any point of the political spectrum. So anyway, I just wanted to put that point because I feel quite strongly about it, that Lula was dramatically misunderstood as well. So anyway, back to my original question. Sorry, I just drifted off onto my own soapbox there for a second. I'd like each of you to give us an example of somebody who's winning, somebody who's losing. Gustavo, let's start with you.
Okay, to answer that question, I'm going to build up on what Edgar was saying. I couldn't agree more on education. And I think that, and answering also, I think it was Eleanor in the chat as well asking for this. I would say, take the long-term view. Like surviving this and being resilient means not looking on the urgency of today. Think about, okay, what's going to be the path? How are we going out of this? What's going to be, I hate the word, the new normal thing, but what's going to be coming next? And based on that scenario, start building today. So I would say right now, I can't think of any company doing well PR-wise in the midst of this. As I said, I was cheating because the pharma companies working on the vaccines are working with several of our governments, but that's not a good PR case that we could extend to all the rest of the audience. I do think that we have to think long-term, and based on that, you will find very, very valuable lessons on where are we going and what we should be communicating. And that goes from digital banks speaking about how being digital, or in most of our countries it's called Mercado Libre, but any kind of e-retailer, or the new way offices will be set. So I would say there is things to communicate right now, start building up towards the future that is coming pretty soon. And remember that hopefully we will all survive this. So there is a couple of things that we should be thinking for the near future, including, as Edgar said, education, education, and education.
Edgar, don't say education again, please.
I would like to. Chris, I'm inclined to think that credibility in an institution is declining, unfortunately. But I think that the brands, which is for who I work mainly, has a great opportunity to show they care, that this is important to them, and to give a response to people main drivers. We are doing this in Costa Rica, we are doing this in Central America, looking for the companies, helping the companies to find this opportunity to show they care.
Sergio, nobody's given us a winner or a loser, and anyway, your position is somewhat different in this conversation. I would like you to tell us I will allow you two, but please no more than two absolute priorities from your point of view in terms of communicating with the rest of Brazil, with your own population, and with the rest of the world, what is going on.
Thank you, Chris. I think we live in very unstable times, right? And we see that in terms of political leadership. I mean, we are following the challenges in Britain regarding the Brexit, and again in the Parliament, we see the very near retirement of Angela Merkel in Germany, which is going to be a very important event next year. We have American elections. So, and we have the rise of China, of course, which is creating enormous waves, including regarding the discussion around technology, the 5G, all around the world, including the recent decisions in Britain and elsewhere is also an issue here in Brazil and across Latin America. So in that context, I think the winners are the ones that can communicate. I mean, the challenges are there. We live in times of emergency regarding the climate and sustainability and technology transition. So what we've been trying to do is to engage, and I think we've been quite successful, to be very honest. During the last 4 months, we closed on-lending programs, large credit programs with the European Investment Bank, with the French Development Agency, with Fomplata. We have very close partnership with the Inter-American Development Bank, and we have established and designed a framework to issue sustainable bonds in the international market. We already started discussions with the London Stock Exchange for that matter, and also with the stock exchange from Luxembourg. We will participate in the Financing Common and the Paris Peace Forum in October. So we're trying to build bridges, not burn them. And we're trying to align, we are fully aligned with the global development agendas, like the SDG agenda, the Agenda 2030. So I believe that building pragmatic solutions that are credible for all the stakeholders, the recipients, but also the ones that are our clients and our investors, is very important. So I think the winners are the ones that are doing that and they have empathy. Going back to Edgar's speech, when you see companies that understand that their brands are not only about selling the product, but also the experience, the relationship, the long-term relationship with their clients and their communities, both from a sourcing point of view, going all the way to the chain, a productive chain to their clients, I think is very important. And we have technology that can do all the traceability and assuring the standards in a much cheaper way than many years ago. So the losers are the ones that don't recognize this new reality and that are not preparing for the post-COVID era, where this will be an even more important objective to pursue.
Very good. Lucas, it's going to be the last word to you. I'm just curious to know, though, if you agree in broad terms with the remark I made about the profound lack of understanding about Brazil, and that what we see about Brazil and the Bolsonaro government internationally is a parody. And Sergio has just told us that, you know, Brazil is fully aligned with UN development goals. Now, that is not something you would read on the front page of any newspaper in London, Paris, or New York.
I agree completely, Chris, and for the good reasons and the bad reasons. One day I was having lunch in Brasilia with the head of a big publication, international publication, who was covering Brazil. And we were not getting along, to be honest. And I told him, I used to get all my information from China on your publication, but now I don't know if I should trust anymore because I'm seeing what you say about Brazil. He was all over the place. So how could I trust what his version of the guy was writing about China? I was a little bit hesitant to trust the publication ever again. I think that what lacks in the foreign press is actually being in the middle of the decision-making process, you know, and being a little bit colder. I feel that a lot of the publications nowadays, if you squeeze them, some blood will come out, or some excess of emotion will come out, even from the good side. And this is from all aspects of the ideology. I think press here in Brazil, either they are being too condescending with the president, and often the other side is attacking for no reason. It's very hard to find cold material. I think that information is almost like, of course, that during the information, you can make it clear that there's an opinion on it. And that's why you have commentators for that. But I think that in Brazil, we are lacking information and excessive commentators giving their opinions. And this becomes worse when the abroad covers Brazil. But I also think that it is what it is. So the governments have to do something about it. So I think this government communicates poorly abroad, communicates poorly internally, and just pointing that the international press covers Brazil in a bad way. And my opinion is that even when they are complimenting him, they're complimenting him for the wrong reasons, and when they are attacking him, they are attacking him for the wrong reasons. I think it's all wrong, from the good and bad. But I think also it's the problem. Now the authorities have to present some sort of strategy to counterattack the problem.
We could have a whole other fascinating discussion on the whole nature of post-news in a post-truth world.
Sure. I'm
more inclined to think that it was ever thus, but it does seem to be a little more in your face these days. And I mean, I read an article the other day in a well-known pink newspaper, which, if it had been directly copied from a press release by the People's Liberation Army, it wouldn't surprise me at all. Even the Japanese bought that newspaper, and everybody was worried that they'd become anti-Chinese. You do read the most extraordinary things. I don't know if there's anybody from the FT on the line. I'd be interested to hear from. Anyway, thank you all very much. That does introduce a whole new topic, Lucas, and maybe we'll get some airtime to talk about it at some point. But I'm very grateful to have had all of you here. We've actually run over by 20 full minutes. I hope it was useful and interesting to the people in the audience. We still have 25 people sitting there listening to us, or maybe they put us on mute and have gone to make a cup of coffee. Probably Costa Rican coffee. But thank you all very much. I don't know if George is there and wants to dive back in, but I will just sign off from me and thank Gustavo, Edgar, Lucas, and Sergio very much for their time and their fascinating conversation.
Yeah,
my pleasure.
I think I'd mirror that, Chris, and thank you very much to the four speakers for your really interesting and valuable insight, and to Chris for doing such a great job at moderating. And just to say, there will be further PRCA Emerging Markets Group events in the coming months, so please keep an eye out, and thank you very much for all of your time.